London, 1972. The city smelled like cigarette smoke, damp concrete, and the particular electricity that only comes before something irreversible happens. Two men were circling each other the way competing flames circle the same oxygen. Not quite touching, not quite extinguishing, but consuming everything between them. One had already conquered the world. The other was about to, and neither of them fully understood yet what the other was capable of. Mick Jagger had been the undisputed king of British rock for nearly a decade by the time David Bowie began his ascent. The Rolling Stones had toured the world, survived scandals that would have destroyed lesser bands, and turned raw blues energy into a commercial and artistic force that redefined what rock music could be. Mick Jagger was not simply a performer. He was a cultural institution, and like most institutions, he had developed an instinctive suspicion of anything that threatened to challenge the order he represented. What Mick saw in David Bowie in the early 1970s was not immediately a rival. It was something more unsettling than that. It was a mirror. Both men were South London boys who had clawed their way out of ordinary lives through sheer force of personality and an almost supernatural ability to inhabit a stage. Both were obsessed with image, with the theatricality of performance, with the idea that a rock concert was not merely a musical event, but a kind of ritual transformation. Both understood intuitively what most musicians only learned slowly and painfully, that the character you presented to an audience could be just as powerful, just as real, as the music itself. But where Mick's theatricality was rooted in a kind of primal sexuality, in the swagger of the blues tradition filtered through sharp clothes and sharper cheekbones, David's was something far stranger and more difficult to categorize. David was building something that had no clear precedent. He was not imitating American rock and roll the way the Stones had done in their early years. He was constructing a mythology entirely his own, drawing on science fiction and kabuki theater and German expressionism and the music halls of his childhood, weaving them together into something that felt simultaneously ancient and from another century entirely. Mick Jagger noticed, and what he noticed made him uncomfortable. The rumors of what Mick said about David during those early years are the kind of thing that traveled through London's music world in whispers, passed from manager to roadie to journalist to musician, until it became impossible to separate the original statement from the accumulation of retellings. But the substance of what reached David's ears was consistent enough to carry the weight of truth. Mick had been at a party in Mayfair, the kind of gathering where the guest list was its own form of currency. The conversation had turned, as it often did in those years, to the rising phenomenon of glam rock, to the sequined invasion that was beginning to reshape what audiences expected from a live show. And Mick, according to those who were present, had been less than impressed. "It is not rock," he said, or words to that effect. "It is theater. It is costume. It is a very sophisticated game of dress up, and there is nothing wrong with dress up, but let us not confuse it with music." And then, with the particular cruelty that comfortable men sometimes deploy against those they secretly fear, he had added, "David is very talented at making people believe he is something. The question is whether there is anything underneath the costume. Whether there is a real musician in there, or whether it is costumes all the way down." The words made their way to David, as words always do in small worlds where everyone knows everyone and everyone is watching everyone else. And David, who had spent his entire life being told that what he was doing was not quite legitimate, not quite serious, not quite enough, filed the information away in that precise and capacious mind of his, and said very little in response. This was one of David Bowie's most underrated qualities. He did not argue. He did not issue counter statements, or seek out journalists to defend himself or challenge Mick Jagger to some public reckoning. He was not built for that kind of confrontation, and he knew it. What he was built for was something quieter and more devastating. He responded in the only language that could not be argued with. He went back to work. The Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars tour of 1972 was already something extraordinary before Mick's comments reached David. But what happened in the months that followed suggested that David had taken the criticism and done what great artists always do with criticisms. He had metabolized it, transformed it, used it as fuel for something his critics could never have anticipated. The shows became more ambitious. The staging evolved. The character of Ziggy Stardust grew more elaborate and more emotionally complex, no longer simply an alien rock star, but a kind of tragic messiah, a figure who carried within his performance the seeds of his own destruction. The audiences who came to see what they expected to be spectacle found themselves confronted with something much more difficult to dismiss. They found themselves moved. This was what Mick had not accounted for, what no one who dismissed David's theatrical ambitions as mere costume could have anticipated. The theater was not decoration. It was not a distraction from the music. It was the music, or rather it was the vessel through which the music reached places that straightforward performance could never access. The Ziggy character allowed David to sing about alienation and longing and the terror of fame and the seduction of destruction with a kind of freedom that would have been impossible if he had been singing simply as himself. The costume was not hiding David Bowie. The costume was releasing him. Word filtered back through the London music world about what was happening at those concerts, about how audiences were leaving them different from how they had arrived, about the strange intimacy that David was creating between performer and crowd, this sense that everyone in the room was participating in something that mattered, something that would not happen again in exactly this way. Mick Jagger, who understood audiences the way a navigator understands currents, understood what he was hearing. And to his credit, because Mick Jagger has always been more complicated than his public persona suggests, he did not double down on dismissal. He began to pay attention. The two men's paths crossed several times during those years, at parties and awards ceremonies and the various social intersections of London's music world. The accounts of these meetings are fragmentary and often contradictory, as first-hand accounts always are when the participants are performing even in their private lives. But certain things appear consistently across the recollections of those who were present. Mick was never simply hostile. The relationship was more interesting and more complicated than that. There was a competitiveness that manifested as a kind of restless watching, each man alert to what the other was doing, each absorbing and cataloging and occasionally, though rarely, openly admiring. And there was, beneath the competition, something that resembled recognition. The recognition of one serious artist for another, however differently their seriousness expressed itself. But the night that everything crystallized, the night that became a fixed point in the mythology that both men would carry for the rest of their careers, came in the summer of 1973. The venue was large enough to matter and intimate enough to feel personal. It was one of those occasions when the music industry gathered to celebrate itself, when the people who made the music, and the people who sold it, and the people who wrote about it occupied the same rooms and pretended that their interests were aligned. David Bowie was there because he had become impossible to ignore. Mick Jagger was there because he was always there, because his presence at such events was part of what defined them. They were in the same room when Mick made a remark that was, depending on who you ask, either a joke or a declaration. He was speaking to a group of people, journalists and record executives, and the various satellites of the music business, and the subject had turned to theatrical performance, to the question of whether what was happening in rock music was a genuine evolution or simply a fashion. Mick said, according to those present, something along the lines of anyone can put on a costume. The question is whether you can take it off and still have something to say. He did not look at David when he said it. He did not need to. Everyone in the room understood the reference, and David, who was close enough to have heard, who understood precisely what was being said, and to whom it was being said, did something that surprised the people watching him. He smiled. Not the performance smile, not the practiced warmth that he deployed in public, but something smaller and more private, the smile of a man who has just been told exactly what he needed to know. What happened next was not immediate. It did not happen that night, or even that week. David Bowie did not rush to a stage to deliver some immediate rebuttal. What he did was slower and more thorough and infinitely more effective. He gave the performance of his life. The Hammersmith Odeon, July 3, 1973. The date that anyone who cares about rock history has stored somewhere in their memory. The night that David Bowie announced, mid-concert, that this would be the last show that Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars would ever perform. The audience did not understand at first. The announcement came without warning, embedded in the show itself, delivered in the breathless intimacy that David had always been able to create between himself and a crowd. And then understanding began to spread through the Hammersmith Odeon like a wave, and what the audience felt was not disappointment so much as grief, the specific grief of witnessing something irreplaceable end. But that was only the surface of what was happening. What David Bowie did that night was answer Mick Jagger's challenge in the most complete and unambiguous way possible. He proved that the costume was not the point. He proved it by taking it off, by killing Ziggy Stardust, the character he had spent 2 years building and inhabiting and pouring himself into. He demonstrated with absolute clarity that he was more than the character, that there was a David Bowie underneath who was capable of making choices that the character could not make, who was capable of artistic decisions so radical and so costly that they made the idea of costume as limitation seem almost laughably beside the point. Anyone can put on a costume, Mick had said. David had replied, I can also take it off. On my own terms, in front of 20,000 people. In a way that will be remembered after both of us are gone. The music press exploded. The Hammersmith performance became immediately legendary. The kind of event that people who were not there would later claim to have witnessed. The kind of night that reshapes how people understand what a concert can be. And what the coverage returned to again and again. In the days and weeks that followed, was not the spectacle of the event, not the production or the staging or the costumes, but the courage of the decision. The artistic integrity of a man who was willing to destroy what he had built, because he understood that it had done its work and it was time to move on. This was what Mick had not understood, and what the criticism about costumes and theatricality had missed entirely. David Bowie was not attached to any particular version of himself. He was not defending Ziggy Stardust or any other character because he was not, in any deep sense, those characters. He was the consciousness that moved through them, the artist who used them as instruments for exploration and then set them aside when the exploration was complete. The costumes were not who he was. They were how he worked. Mick Jagger, to his considerable credit, understood what had happened at Hammersmith. He had been in the music business long enough, and was intelligent enough to recognize when he had encountered something he had not fully accounted for. The reports that filtered back through the London music world in the months after Hammersmith suggested that Mick's comments about David had shifted in register, become less dismissive and more complicated, inflected with the particular respect that one serious artist extends to another when they have been surprised. The two men would continue their parallel careers for decades, their paths intersecting and diverging in the complex choreography of British rock's long century. They would collaborate in ways that seemed to surprise both of them, most notably on the 1985 recording of Dancing in the Street, which became a charity single and a cultural moment of its own. Two men in the full heat of their middle years finding a playful ease together that neither their public personas nor their history quite predicted. The video from that session is one of the most joyful documents in the archive of rock music. Two men who had spent years circling each other, finally simply dancing together. The competition dissolved into something that looked remarkably like friendship. But that came later. In 1973, in the aftermath of Hammersmith, what existed between them was something more interesting than friendship and more generative than rivalry. It was the recognition that they were engaged in the same project from opposite ends, both trying to understand what rock music could carry, what a performer could ask of an audience, how far the form could be stretched before it became something else entirely. Mick had approached these questions from the body, from rhythm and sexuality, and the deep blues tradition. David had approached them from the mind, from theater and narrative, and the radical possibility of reinvention. Neither approach was complete without the other, and both men, in their different ways, knew it. The night at Hammersmith stayed in the cultural memory, not because of what David Bowie had proven about himself, but because of what it had revealed about the nature of artistic integrity. The easiest thing, after Mick's comments, would have been to defend the theatrical approach, to make the case for it in interviews and discussions, to point to the audiences and the sales figures and the critical reception as evidence that the critics were wrong. David did none of that. He did something harder and stranger, and ultimately more persuasive. He changed, and in changing he made the argument that no costume, no character, no artistic persona, however successful and beloved, was more important than the ongoing work of the artist who wore it. He made the argument in the only way that arguments can be made definitively, not with words but with action, not with defense but with transformation. Years later, when David Bowie was asked about the Hammersmith moment, about the decision to retire Ziggy Stardust, he spoke about it the way he spoke about most things that mattered to him, obliquely, precisely, with a quality of attention that made you feel that each word had been chosen from a very large number of possible words. He said that the character had served its purpose, that it had allowed him to explore certain questions that he needed to explore. And that when those questions were answered, or rather when he understood that they could not be answered, but only endlessly refined, it was time to move on. He said that he had never been interested in repetition, that the fear of repeating himself was one of the most reliable spurs to his creativity, that the moment a thing became comfortable was usually the moment it had stopped being useful. He did not mention Mick Jagger's comments. He never did, in any interview or public statement. Whether this was because the comments had not mattered to him, or because they had mattered very much and he had chosen not to give them the dignity of acknowledgement, only David would have known. And David, characteristically, kept his own counsel. What remained, when all the speculation and mythology were set aside, was simpler and more durable than any of it. Two extraordinary musicians had pushed each other, through competition and observation and the particular mutual pressure that only real peers can exert, toward work that neither might have reached alone. Mick Jagger's skepticism about theatrical rock had not diminished David Bowie. It had, in the way that all genuine challenges do, clarified him. And David Bowie's response, so total and so precisely aimed, had not defeated Mick Jagger. It had, in the way that great art always does to those paying close enough attention, expanded him. That is the story that London whispered about in the years that followed, in the rehearsal rooms and the green rooms and the late night conversations that make up the actual texture of a music scene. Not a story of rivalry and victory, but a story of two men who made each other better by refusing to agree. The city had smelled like cigarette smoke and damp concrete and electricity that night in 1972 when it all began. By the summer of 1973, the electricity had done its work. Something had been created that neither man could have made without the friction between them. And in the silence, after the last chord rang out at Hammersmith, in the moment before the crowd understood what they had witnessed, that something hung in the air above 20,000 people who would spend the rest of their lives trying to describe what they had felt. Some called it genius. Some called it courage. Some called it the end of an era. David Bowie, if he had been in the mood to answer, might have called it simply the next step. The costumes set aside. The work continuing. The questions, as always, still open. The real answer was in the music. It always was.